They say, a man who's never been poor has no business judging one who pretends to be. I've been both in my life, and I can tell you the pretending is harder. My name is Frank Delacroix, and for the last 26 years I have been the richest poor man on Magnolia Court. I am 64 years old. I drive a 1998 Ford Ranger with a tailgate that doesn't latch right and a passenger door you have to slam twice. The paint used to be dark green. Now it's the color of a green that gave up arguing with the sun a long time ago. My son-in-law has offered to buy me a new truck 3 separate times. I have declined 3 separate times, not because I can't afford one. Because I own the dealership he'd be buying it from, along with 11 others across 4 states, and there is something almost holy about watching a man try to be generous with money that was mine to begin with. I wear the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation. I fix my own gutters. I sit on my porch on Sunday evenings with a glass of sweet tea and wave at Dolores across the street, who has told me twice that I remind her of her late husband, God rest him, a man who never had 2 nickels to rub together but never once looked poor in spirit. I let her believe that. It's kinder than the truth, and the truth doesn't need an audience. Here's what nobody on Magnolia Court knows, what my church knows. What? The boy at the AutoZone who tried to sell me a new battery for the Ranger last month doesn't know when I told him the old one had a few good years left in it. I own Meridian Holdings, trucking, warehousing, cold storage, a stake in 2 regional airports. Built it from a single flatbed truck and a business loan my own father co-signed against his life insurance policy, back when I was 22 and too stubborn to know better. 42 years of 6 a.m., mornings and handshake deals, and never, not once, putting my name on a building. Meridian Holdings is worth $2.8 billion. I drive a truck that smells faintly of motor oil no matter how many times I clean it, and I would not trade it for anything with a bow on it. Now, let me tell you about my daughter. Casey Delacroix Reyes is 31 years old, and she is the only thing I ever built that I'm actually proud of. If I'm being honest with myself, prouder than the 11 dealerships, prouder than the warehouses, prouder than any of it. She's got her mother's stubbornness, which is to say she's never lost an argument in her life, including several she was factually wrong about. When she was 8, she talked me into letting her keep a stray dog by presenting me with a handwritten contract outlining the dog's chores. I still have that contract in a drawer somewhere. What I did not see coming, what I never once considered in 31 years of worrying about this exact thing, was the man she'd bring home. 4 years ago, Casey introduced me to Marcus Whitfield. I want to give Marcus his due here, I really do, because a man deserves to be judged fairly, even in the retelling. So let me say this as generously as I'm able. Marcus Whitfield has never met a room he didn't try to own within the first 90 seconds of entering it. He's 36, tall, the kind of handsome that comes from a gym membership and good dental work, and he has a way of turning any conversation, any single one, into an opportunity to mention something he's accomplished, something he owns, or somewhere impressive he recently flew business class to. Within 20 minutes of meeting me, he'd worked in his law degree, his golf handicap, and a ski trip to Aspen. He said, Aspen, the way certain men say it when they need you to picture the chalet. I nodded along. I said, that sounds real nice, son. 8 months after meeting Casey, Marcus Whitfield was named General Manager of Coastline Logistics, one of the largest operations under the Meridian Holdings umbrella. 380 employees, contracts with 2 major national retailers, a company I'd spent 15 years building into something real. Marcus got that job through what looked, from every visible angle, like a completely legitimate hiring process. Executive search firm, 4 rounds of interviews, background checks, a formal offer from the board. Clean as a whistle, on paper. What nobody knew, what Marcus Whitfield still does not know to this day, is that I personally reviewed every application that came through that search, watched the final round of interviews from behind a one-way arrangement I'd quietly built into the search firm's contract years earlier, and signed off on his hire myself. Then I drove home in the Ranger, changed into work clothes, and spent the evening replacing a cracked paver on my front walk. Marcus texted Casey that night, and she read it to me over the phone, practically glowing. Tell your dad I landed it. GM of a whole logistics division, Big things coming. I told her to tell him, congratulations. Then I went to bed early, because pavers wait for no man. I want to be honest about something. In the beginning, I gave Marcus every benefit of the doubt a father can give a man his daughter loves. I've hired hundreds of people over 4 decades. I know first impressions lie sometimes. People surprise you. Marcus Whitfield did not surprise me. What he did, slowly, patiently, in the way these things always reveal themselves, was show me exactly who he was, one small moment at a time. It started at a company holiday party about 6 months into his tenure. Casey had asked me to come, and I did, in my usual clothes, because that's simply what I wear. Marcus introduced me to a cluster of his colleagues, and one of them, a younger fellow with a suit 2 sizes too sharp, asked what line of work I was in. Before I could answer, Marcus jumped in smooth as anything. Oh, Frank's retired. Casey's dad. Used to do something with trucks, I think. He said it the way you'd describe a hobby somebody grew out of. Then he steered the young man toward the bar, and I was left standing there, holding a plastic cup of eggnog, effectively dismissed from my own company's Christmas party. I smiled. I found a seat by the window. I filed it away, the way I file most things, quietly, permanently, without comment. But the moment that actually mattered, the one that changed the temperature of everything, happened on a Wednesday about 5 months ago. I'd stopped by Coastline's regional office to handle a small ownership matter through one of my holding entities, the kind of quiet administrative visit I make a few times a year, unremarkable, unnoticed, an old man in a canvas jacket that nobody looks at twice. I was walking past the break room near the executive suite when I heard Marcus's voice through the half-open door, talking to somebody, another manager, by the sound of the second voice. I stopped walking. Casey's dad, Marcus was saying, and I could hear him grinning through the words, honestly, harmless guy. I think he peaked, like 30 years ago, had some little trucking thing that went okay, and now he just fixes his own gutters and drives this truck that should legally be in a junkyard. He laughed at his own joke. Casey feels obligated to include him in everything, which, family's family, I guess. But between you and me, the guy's basically a museum piece. I stood in that hallway for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I straightened my jacket and walked back the way I'd come, past the elevators, out to the parking lot, and sat in the Ranger for a good 10 minutes before I turned the key. Museum piece. Peaked 30 years ago. I let those words sit with me the way you let a splinter sit before you decide it's finally time to dig it out. My father used to tell me, back when I was young and hot-headed, that a patient man doesn't need to raise his voice, because time does the shouting for him eventually. I've never forgotten that. I kept it in my back pocket for 5 months. If you're the kind of person who sticks around for stories like this one, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Doesn't cost you a thing, and it means more than you'd think to a channel just getting its legs under it. Now, back to Marcus. The dinner invitation came on a Sunday evening in March. Casey called me, bright and easy, the way she always sounds when she's happy. Marcus's parents, Richard and Elaine Whitfield, wanted to host a proper family dinner at their place out in Brentwood Hills, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns look like they've been individually blow-dried. Richard had spent 30 years running a private wealth management firm before retiring. Elaine sat on the boards of a few charities whose galas cost more than most people's mortgages. They really want to get to know you, Dad, Casey said. I think it'll be good. We're all family now. Here's the part that made that sentence hard to sit with. I already knew a fair amount about Richard and Elaine Whitfield, more than Casey realized, because a man in my position tends to know who's circling his daughter's life. I knew, for instance, that Richard's wealth management firm had quietly lost 2 of its largest institutional clients the year before, after a compliance issue that never made the papers but made the right closed-door conversations. I knew Elaine's charity board seats were, in more than one case, a condition of donations that came out of dwindling reserves rather than growing ones. I said none of this to Casey. I told her I couldn't wait. Then Marcus called me directly, which itself told me something, because Marcus rarely called me for anything that wasn't strategic. He was friendly in that particular practiced way, the tone people use right before they say something they already know is a little insulting but have decided is worth the risk anyway. Hey, Frank, quick heads up about Saturday. My parents are pretty, uh, traditional, old money, you know how that crowd is. Might be worth stepping it up a notch, clothes-wise. Nothing crazy, just, something that says you made an effort. I let a beat of silence sit there before I answered. I appreciate you thinking of me, son, I said. Of course, he said, relieved, like he'd been dreading the conversation. Just want everybody comfortable, you know how it is. I do, I said. I'll see you Saturday. I hung up the phone and stood in my hallway for a while, looking at myself in the mirror by the coat rack. Then I walked to my closet, past the two suits I own, the navy one I wore to Casey's wedding and the charcoal one I wore to my wife's funeral 11 years ago, and I reached instead for my cleanest flannel shirt and a pair of khakis with a crease still in them from being folded too long. I laid them out on the bed for Saturday. Then I walked out to the driveway, put my hand flat on the hood of the old Ranger, the way you'd rest a hand on the shoulder of an old friend before a hard conversation. We're going to a dinner, girl, I said to the truck, because a man's allowed his eccentricities at 64. Dress code's humble. Good thing that's the only outfit we own. Because here's what Marcus didn't understand, what Richard and Elaine Whitfield didn't understand, what not a single person in that dining room was going to understand until it was far, far too late to matter. I wasn't underdressing because I owned nothing better. I was underdressing because I wanted to watch, with my own eyes, exactly who these people turned into when they believed there was nothing in the room worth performing for. 42 years in business teaches you that the real face only comes out when a man thinks the stakes are low. I had a feeling, quiet and certain and built on 4 decades of reading rooms for a living, that Saturday was going to show me everything I needed to know. Saturday arrived the way important days tend to, without any particular fanfare, just another gray morning that had no idea what it was about to become. I woke at 5:30 like I have most mornings since I was 22, made coffee black in the same percolator I've had since Casey was in grade school, and sat at my kitchen table watching the light come up slow over my backyard fence. I was calm. I'm generally calm. It's the most underrated tool in a man's kit. Calm is more useful over a lifetime than any amount of shouting ever was. I dressed the way I'd planned. Flannel, khakis, work boots I'd polished the night before, out of some private sense of respect that had nothing to do with impressing anybody. No watch worth a second glance. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror and thought, yes, that's exactly the man I want them to meet first. I walked out to the truck. The Ranger sat in the driveway, catching the early light on its cracked side mirror, patient as ever. I climbed in, turned the key, and the engine did its usual throat-clearing routine before settling into a rattle I'd long since stopped hearing as a problem and started hearing as a voice. "Let's go meet the in-laws," I said, and pointed us toward Brentwood Hills. The Whitfield estate sat behind a stone gate at the end of a driveway lined with hedges trimmed into shapes too precise to be accidental, the kind of landscaping that exists purely to tell visitors, before they've even parked, that somebody here controls things down to the leaf. There was a young man stationed near the front steps in a black polo, not quite valet, not quite security, whose entire function seemed to be silently evaluating whoever pulled up based on what they were driving. He looked at the Ranger, he looked at me. He looked back at the Ranger with an expression I have seen more times in my life than I could ever count, the look of a young man doing quick, unfavorable math in his head. "Evening, sir," he said, recovering his composure fast. "I can park that for you." "Much obliged," I said, handing him the keys. "She pulls right a little under 40. Don't let it worry you." He nodded with the strained neutrality of a man determined not to have any visible feelings about the vehicle in his hands. I straightened my flannel and walked toward the front door, which opened before I'd even reached it. Richard Whitfield stood there, tall, 71, silver hair combed with the kind of precision that takes effort to look effortless, dressed in the specific uniform of wealthy men relaxing at home, clothes that cost more than most people's formal wear while working very hard to look casual. His smile was warm in the way a hotel lobby is warm, pleasant, professional, and entirely temporary. "Frank," he said, extending a hand that gripped mine exactly as long as etiquette required and not a second more. "So glad you could make it. Come on in." The house delivered on everything the driveway had promised. High ceilings, art on the walls selected to communicate taste rather than to be looked at, a chandelier in the entryway that had clearly never once flickered from a power surge. Elaine Whitfield swept in from the kitchen in a silk blouse, air-kissed the space near my cheek, and told me how absolutely wonderful it was to finally meet Casey's father. The word finally sat there a beat too long, doing quiet work I noted and set aside. Casey hugged me tight in the hallway and whispered that she was so glad I'd come, and for her, in that moment, every bit of it was worth it. Dinner was lamb, served on plates that probably cost more individually than my truck's last oil change. The conversation moved the way conversations move in houses like that, smooth and shallow, skating over real topics the way you skate over thin ice, quickly and with a kind of practiced grace. Richard asked me polite, condescending questions about my little venture, and I gave him polite, modest answers, mentioning nothing about Meridian, nothing about the 11 dealerships, nothing about the 2 airports. Elaine asked whether I found retirement fulfilling, and I told her the garden kept me busy, which was true, if incomplete. It was over dessert that the real purpose of the evening finally showed its face. Richard set down his wine glass with a small, deliberate clink and cleared his throat in the way men clear their throats right before they ask you for something they've already decided you're going to give them. "Frank, I'll be direct, since I respect directness," he said. "Marcus has an opportunity in front of him. A logistics tech startup, brilliant young founders, ground floor stuff, the kind of thing that comes along once in a career. He wants to leave Coastline and go all in on it. It's a phenomenal opportunity." He paused for effect. "The one hurdle is capital. And frankly, given everything going on with our own holdings right now, timing isn't ideal on our end to be the ones to bridge it." Elaine leaned forward with the practiced warmth of a woman delivering bad news wrapped in silk. "We were thinking, and I hope this doesn't feel forward, but Casey does have that inheritance coming eventually from your side, doesn't she? We simply thought, perhaps there's a way to use that as collateral now, so Marcus can seize this window while it's open. Everyone benefits. It keeps the money in the family, really." Casey's face went through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds: surprise, discomfort, and then a kind of pleading look aimed at me, silently asking me not to make this into something ugly at her in-laws' table. Marcus said nothing, which told me plenty, because a man secure in his own plan usually says something. I set my fork down slowly. "That's an interesting proposal," I said, keeping my voice as even as the coffee I drink every morning. "Help me understand something, though. Richard, you ran a wealth management firm for 30 years. Elaine, you sit on, what is it, 4 boards now. Between the 2 of you, I'd imagine there's no shortage of avenues for a bridge loan that doesn't require borrowing against my daughter's future." The table went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when somebody said the thing everyone was avoiding. "It's more complicated than that," Richard said, a little too fast. "I imagine it is," I said, and left it there, because I already knew precisely how complicated it was. And I wasn't in the business of embarrassing a man at his own table over dessert, not yet. Not when there was still a cleaner way to handle it. I finished my lamb. I told Elaine it was excellent, because it was. I thanked them for the evening, hugged my daughter goodbye in the driveway, and told her I'd call her Sunday, same as always. Then I collected the ranger from the boy in the black polo, tipped him more than he expected, and drove home with the windows cracked, letting the cool March air do some of my thinking for me. Monday morning, I called my attorney, a sharp, quiet woman named Patricia N. Kemalu, who has handled Meridian's affairs for 19 years and has never once repeated a word I've told her in confidence. I asked her to pull everything, every filing, every internal report, every complaint that had ever crossed a compliance desk at Richard Whitfield's firm over the last 5 years, along with a full accounting of exactly what Marcus Whitfield had actually been doing during his 8 months as general manager of Coastline Logistics. I had my suspicions about the second part. I wanted them confirmed before I acted on anything. It took Patricia 11 days to bring me the folder. What was in it did not surprise me the way it might have surprised somebody less accustomed to reading a balance sheet for what it isn't saying as much as what it is. Richard Whitfield's firm had been quietly bleeding institutional clients for 2 years, not 1, following a compliance failure that had been settled privately to avoid a public filing. The kind of settlement that keeps a man's reputation intact while gutting his actual liquidity behind the scenes. The Brentwood Hills estate carried 2 mortgages, not one, the second taken out 18 months ago. Elaine's board seats, every single one, had been secured through donation pledges the family could no longer comfortably honor. Richard and Elaine Whitfield were not wealthy. They were performing wealthy, on borrowed time and borrowed money, and Casey's inheritance wasn't a convenience to them. It was a lifeline they intended to use to keep the performance running just a little longer, dressed up as an opportunity for their son. And Marcus. Marcus, in 8 months as general manager of Coastline Logistics, had approved 2 vendor contracts with companies that, buried under 3 layers of shell entities, traced back to a business partner of his own from business school, a man named Tyler Kessler, at rates roughly 20% above market. Nothing illegal on its face, nothing a lazy audit would have caught, but exactly the kind of quiet self-dealing that erodes a company from the inside while looking, on paper, like ordinary business. 380 employees were working under a general manager who'd spent 8 months treating my company like a personal ATM disguised as a career opportunity, all while telling his colleagues in a break room that I was a museum piece who'd peaked 30 years ago. I sat with that folder open on my kitchen table for a long while that evening, the same table where Casey did her homework as a girl, and I thought about my father, who co-signed a loan against his own life insurance so a stubborn 22-year-old could buy one flatbed truck, and who never once, not one single time in his life, asked for anything back beyond respect. I thought about what kind of man I wanted my daughter married to, and what kind of grandfather I wanted for children who didn't exist yet but might someday. Then I closed the folder and called Marcus directly, which surprised him, since I rarely called him for anything. "Marcus," I said, "I need you at the Coastline offices Thursday morning, 10 o'clock. Bring whoever else needs to be there." "Is everything okay, Frank?" he asked. And for the first time in 4 years I heard something underneath his usual smoothness, a thin thread of uncertainty he didn't quite manage to smooth over. "We'll talk Thursday," I said, and hung up. Thursday morning, I put on the charcoal suit, the one I'd worn to my wife's funeral, because some occasions call for a man to look like exactly who he is rather than who he's pretending to be. I drove the Ranger downtown, parked it in the executive lot in the one spot that's always been technically reserved for me under a holding company name nobody at Coastline had ever bothered to trace, and walked into the building I owned wearing an old truck's dust on my boots and a folder under my arm that was about to end somebody's career. Marcus was already in the boardroom when I walked in, along with 2 members of the Coastline board, and at my specific request, Patricia. He stood when I entered out of some reflexive habit, then sat back down slowly, confusion working its way across his face as he clocked the folder, the suit, the 2 board members whose presence he clearly hadn't been expecting. "Frank, what's going on here?" he asked, trying for casual and landing somewhere closer to nervous. "Marcus," I said, taking a seat at the head of the table, a chair I'd never once sat in during any of my quiet visits to this building. "I think it's time you and I had a real conversation. Not as your girlfriend's father. As the man who owns Coastline Logistics and Meridian Holdings, and the company that hired you 8 months ago through a process I personally controlled from start to finish." I watched his face empty out, watched 42 years of my patience finally do the shouting my father always promised it would. I laid it out plainly, calmly, the vendor contracts, Tyler Kessler, the shell entities, the 20% markup that had quietly cost the company just north of $400,000 over 8 months. I did not raise my voice. I have never once found it necessary. He tried denial first, then a clumsy attempt at reframing it as aggressive vendor management, and finally, when Patricia slid the documentation across the table, he went quiet, small, and very young, looking for a man who'd spent 4 years talking about Aspen. "However," I said, "I'm not interested in ruining you. I'm interested in the truth being known by the people who need to know it. So, here's how this goes. You resign today, quietly, effective immediately. Coastline's board issues a standard statement about pursuing new opportunities. This stays inside these walls. Or we pursue this formally, and everything in this folder becomes part of a public record, including a call to Tyler Kessler's other business partners, several of whom I suspect don't know about this arrangement either." He looked at the board members. He looked at Patricia. He looked back at me, and I saw something in his face I genuinely hadn't expected from him in 4 years. Not anger, not some slick attempt to talk his way out, but shame, the real kind, the kind that only shows up when a man finally sees the whole shape of himself and doesn't care for the view. "I'll resign," he said quietly, like the words were costing him something to spend. "Good," I said. I stood, buttoned my jacket, picked up the folder. "One more thing," I said at the door. "The collateral your father proposed at dinner. Using Casey's inheritance to fund your little venture with the shell company money you've already been skimming. That's not happening." My attorney finalized the transfer of Casey's full inheritance into her name directly this past Tuesday, irrevocable, in an account only she can access. So, whatever Richard and Elaine were counting on has already stopped existing. "Tell your parents I said thank you for the lamb. It really was excellent." I drove home in the Ranger. The engine cleared its throat the way it always does at the first turn of the key. The cracked side mirror caught the last of the afternoon light as I pulled onto Magnolia Court and into my driveway. I sat there a moment, just sat, hands on the wheel. 26 years of being the man nobody looked at twice, knowing exactly who I was the whole time regardless. I patted the dashboard once. Good girl, I thought. Then I went inside and called my daughter. Casey showed up 20 minutes later, and I could tell from her face in the doorway that Marcus had already called her, that she knew something had happened even if she didn't yet know what. We sat at the kitchen table, 2 cups of coffee already poured, and she looked at me the long, careful way she's looked at my face since she was small, reading it like a book she's read 100 times and still finds new pages in. I told her everything. 8. Meridian, the trucking company that grew into a holding empire, the dealership, the 2 airports, coastline, the hiring process I'd controlled from the start, the vendor scheme, the folder, the boardroom, and the inheritance transfer I'd made the same week I'd asked Patricia to start pulling files. When I finished, Casey sat very still for a long time, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. Then she looked up at me and asked the only question that mattered, the one I'd been carrying an answer to for longer than she'd been alive to ask it. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" I looked down at my coffee, out the kitchen window at the dark shape of my backyard fence, and back at my daughter, at her mother's eyes looking out of her face, at the stubborn 8-year-old who'd once out-negotiated me over a stray dog and won. "Because I wanted you choosing your own life," I said, "not one that got handed to you because of what I own. I never wanted you looking at me and seeing a company. I wanted you seeing your father." She cried, quiet and real, and I held her hand across that table and let her, the way you let somebody grieve something they didn't know they'd lost until it was already gone, which in this case was 4 years of believing in a man who'd never really existed the way she thought he had. And I thought, briefly, about Richard sitting in that overmortgaged house in Brentwood Hills, about Elaine setting down her wine glass when the phone rang, about Marcus trying to find the words to explain to his parents why the quiet old man in the flannel shirt had turned out to be the one person at that table they should never, not for one single second, have underestimated. I thought about all of it, and then I let it go, because the only thing that actually mattered to me was sitting right in front of me, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, eyes red, starting to smile through the last of it. My daughter, the only thing I ever built that I'm genuinely proud of. Some men don't look like much. They just are what they are, quietly, for as long as it takes. And sooner or later, the ones who mistake that for nothing always find out exactly how wrong they were. If this one landed for you, do me a favor and hit like, and stick around, because there's more where this came from.